I learned something the hard way. The most dangerous men are not always hungry for power. Sometimes they are hungry for peace. And when a broken man finds that peace in the hands of one woman, he does not forget her. He does not share her, and he does not let her go. That realization did not come to me in a flash of danger, but on a regular Tuesday lunch rush. A line of black SUVs had pulled up to my Chicago food cart, parting the crowd like a bruised sea. Inside the center car sat a man who looked less like a king and more like a ghost, violently rejecting a bite of overly rich, expensive food. Without overthinking it, I turned down the flame under my pan, tossed in fresh pasta, lemon, and butter. When it was done, I took a clean fork, set it in the bowl, stepped out from behind my cart, and walked straight toward the sort of men most people learn to avoid without needing to be told. The nearest bodyguard moved into my path at once. "Back up," he said, like that settled the matter. "If he eats another bite of that," I said, looking past him instead of at him, "he is going to feel worse." He did not like that. I could tell by the way his shoulders shifted, the way his jaw tightened, the quick flick of his eyes that measured how much force would be needed to remove me if Dominic gave the word. I said, "Back up." I ignored him and looked directly into the car. "That food is too rich," I said. "He needs something plain." Dominic lifted his head and looked at me, up close or close enough for the Chicago street between us to stop matching. His eyes were darker than I expected and much more awake than the rest of him. Not soft, not friendly, just fully alert in a body that was clearly tired of hurting. "What is it?" he asked. His voice was rough and low, the kind of voice that never needed to get louder because people leaned in on instinct. I held up the bowl. Lemon pasta, light broth, butter, salt, no cream, no nonsense. The bodyguard started to say something, but Dominic cut him off without looking away from me. "Did I ask you?" That was the moment the whole street realized who was really in charge. I stepped closer and held the bowl out properly. "Try it or do not," I said. "But if you keep trusting whoever made that," and I nodded toward the white container now sitting open and untouched beside him, "you are going to regret it." A few people behind me in line made the small shot sound people make when someone says exactly the thing they are all thinking, but none of them would ever dare say themselves. I did not care. He looked at the bowl, then at me, then back at the bowl again, as if something about the whole situation offended him and interested him in equal measure. "Are you always this rude?" he asked. "Only when I am right." Something flickered near his mouth, so brief it barely counted as an expression, but I caught it anyway. Then he reached for the bowl. The man beside him stiffened like he might stop him, but one look from his boss was enough to freeze him from where he stood. Dominic took the fork, lifted one careful bite, and let it sit on his tongue for 1 second before swallowing. The change in him was small, but I am a cook, and cooks read bodies long before people admit what those bodies are feeling. His shoulders loosened first, then the hard line around his mouth eased. Then his breathing deepened in the smallest, quiet way, like some part of him that had been braced for damage realized none was coming. The men around him noticed too. I saw it in their faces, the shock quickly hidden, the exchanged glances, the almost disbelief. He took another bite, then another. By the fourth, he had stopped looking at the bowl like it might betray him. The whole street had gone still enough to hear the wind move paper under a parked car. When he finished, he handed the bowl back to me and looked at me in a way I did not like at all, because it was the kind of look powerful men get when something unexpected matters to them. "What is your name?" he asked. I took the bowl and held out my other hand. "Clara, the woman who charges for food," I said. $12. That actually got a reaction, though not from him at first. One of his men blinked like I had spoken in another language. The bodyguard nearest me looked personally offended on his boss' behalf. Dominic, however, seemed only more interested. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick fold of cash, and offered me 100. I took 12, folded the rest back into his hand, and said that I did not need charity, and I did not overcharge sick men just because they came in armored cars. "Who said I am sick?" he asked. "No one had to," I said. "You have not been able to keep food down in a while. Your body gave it away." That got me another silence, but this one felt different. He was studying me now. Not my face, not my mouth, not my body, just me, as if I had suddenly become a question he had not meant to take home. "You think you know my body?" he asked. "I know food," I said. The answer sat between us for a second. Then some poor man at the back of my line called out loud and annoyed, asking if lunch was still happening or if we were all supposed to stand there and die curious. That broke the tension enough for me to step back toward my cart. I told the next customer to come forward and went right back to my pen as though feeding dangerous strangers from luxury vehicles was just another part of city life. I could feel Dominic still watching me, though I did not look up again until I heard the doors shut and saw him step out onto the sidewalk. He was taller than I expected, broader too, but not bulky, not heavy, just built like a man who carried control in his muscles. There was nothing flashy about him apart from the obvious money on his body. The danger came from stillness, not display. He crossed the few feet to my cart, set the empty bowl on the counter, and said, "Tomorrow, same time." I stirred my sauce and did not look up. I do not take orders through car windows. "You just did." That was not an order, that was me saving your afternoon. There it was again, that near smile that never quite arrived but somehow made his face more dangerous instead of less. "Tomorrow," he repeated. "If I am here, I am here. What if I want the same dish?" "Then get in line." One of the men behind him actually looked offended that I had said it. The man in front of me seemed more awake than he had 5 minutes earlier. He held my gaze a beat longer, then turned, got back into the SUV, and the whole line of black cars pulled away. The noise returned in pieces. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone swore. 3 people tried to talk to me at once, but I told the next customer to stop staring and decide what he wanted because lunch was still happening whether the city approved or not. I worked the rest of the afternoon with people openly watching me in a way they had not watched me that morning, and I hated that I enjoyed it a little. By the time the lunch rush died and I started wiping down the counter, the flower woman from 2 stalls over came near enough to speak without raising her voice and told me that the man in the car had been Dominic Vance. The name meant something immediately, though not because I spent my nights reading crime pages or caring about men who bought the city in pieces. His name lived in the background of things, in warning tones, in half-finished stories, in the way people lowered their voices when power and money and fear began sharing a sentence. I told myself on the walk home that the whole thing was over because that is what's sensible. People tell themselves after brushing up against danger and making it out with all their fingers still attached. I cleaned the cart, counted the day's cash, locked up, slept badly anyway, and returned the next morning with no plan other than to work. By 11:30, I had almost convinced myself the previous day had stayed where it belonged. Then 2 men in suits stopped in front of my cart. One was the bodyguard from the SUV, the one who had tried to block me. The other was older, calmer, with silver at his temples, and the kind of face that put people at ease until they noticed the eyes, and understood that ease was only another form of control. He introduced himself as Elias, Dominic's right-hand man. He said the reason they were there. Dominic wanted a private meal prepared that evening. I said no before he finished the sentence. The younger one looked like he had expected trouble and had found it right on time, but Elias did not seem surprised. He set a thick card on my counter anyway. He said Dominic had kept down every bite of the meal I made the day before, that it had been the first full meal he had managed without pain in nearly 5 years, and that the difference mattered. That stopped my hand on the spoon. 5 years was too long for anything to be casual. I asked why. Delia said it had started after a poisoning, a family dinner, someone close enough to be trusted, a plate placed in front of Dominic with a smile and death in it. He said Dominic had lived, but his father had not. And since that night, his body had never fully relearned the difference between nourishment and danger. Doctors had names for it. Specialists had theories for it. Private chefs had failed at fixing it. He could force himself through enough to survive, but that was all. Then Elias looked at me and said that yesterday I had handed his boss food with no fear in my face, no greed in my hands, and no hunger for anything from him. I should have said no again, and maybe I would have if the whole thing had sounded dramatic or manipulative, but it did not. It sounded like a wound that had settled so deep into a man's life that everyone around him had learned to treat it like weather. Worse than that, it sounded true. So I laid down my conditions anyway. I was not joining anyone's staff. I would not wear a uniform. I would choose the dish. I would cook my way. I would leave when I wanted. Nobody would hover. Nobody would touch my ingredients. If any of that was a problem, then Dominic Vance could continue starving in peace. Elias listened without interrupting, looked almost amused by the end of it, and said 6 o'clock. The building downtown was the kind of rich that tried to look clean instead of loud, but there was no real difference in the end. Money still changes the temperature of a room. An elevator took me up to a private floor where Elias was waiting. He led me through a penthouse full of stone, glass, and expensive emptiness until we reached a kitchen bigger than my apartment. I stood in the doorway and told Elias it was impressive in the same tone people use when they mean unnecessary. Dominic came in before Elias could answer. No suit jacket. This time. Black shirt, sleeves rolled, face still sharp, but less formal in his own space, which somehow made him more dangerous instead of less. He looked at the bag in my hand and said I had brought my own ingredients into his home. I told him I did not know his kitchen. He asked if I thought it was unsafe. I said I thought trust worked both ways. That landed harder than I expected. Then he stepped aside and told me to cook. I unpacked in silence while he watched. Fresh pasta, lemon, beans, herbs, good broth, bread, things with integrity, things that knew how to settle a body instead of impress a table. I cooked him lemon pasta first, then toast with white beans and broth. When I told him to sit, Saturday when I set the bowl down in front of him, he looked at it the way a man looks at a door he wants to believe is unlocked but cannot quite trust himself to touch. The first bite took effort, the second took less. By the fourth, something had softened in his shoulders so clearly that even without knowing the full story yet, I understood I was watching a body step out of war. He finished the bowl, tore through the bread, and then looked at me with something new in his face, something more dangerous than fascination, because it held relief inside it. I forgot what warm food felt like, he said. It was such a sad sentence, and he said it so plainly that I did not know where to put my own reaction for a second. So I looked away and told him that was a miserable thing to say in a kitchen this nice. Elias disappeared after that, leaving the two of us in a room that had somehow become far too intimate for a first real meeting. I cleaned while Dominic drank warm water the way I told him to, and we talked in pieces. He told me that after that night the body had remembered before the mind did, and every meal became a fight because food no longer arrived as comfort. It arrived as threat wearing the face of care. I made him a second meal before I left, a softer one. Broth and rice and ginger. Not because he had asked, but because my instincts told me not to send a body like that back into the night on one good bowl alone. He ate it slowly while watching me pack my knives. Then he asked if I would come back tomorrow. I said no at once. He asked why. I told him because if I started coming into his life every day, sooner or later somebody would start calling me his, and I had worked too hard to belong to myself just to become convenient in a powerful man's story. Something dark and unreadable passed through his eyes at that. Does that bother you? He asked. I told him yes. He said, even if it keeps me alive. I hated that line so much. I told him he did not get to make his survival my responsibility. He took that without arguing. Then he wrote a number on the back of one of my order slips and handed it over, saying that if I changed my mind, I could call it. I left the penthouse with the number in my bag and the feeling that something had shifted in a direction I did not control, but I had only made it 2 blocks when a black sedan rolled up beside me and the rear window came down. 3 men I did not know sat inside, and I knew at once they were the wrong kind of dangerous. They were not Vance men. They looked rougher around the edges, meaner, sloppier in the eyes. One of them smiled at me like we had met at a party instead of on a dark Chicago street after I had just left a powerful man's building. He said their boss wanted a word. I said I was busy. He said it would not take long. I said no again. Then he looked past me toward the tower I had left and said almost pleasantly that Dominic Vance really was hungry after all. That was when I understood this had moved too fast for comfort. The back door of the sedan unlocked with a click, and the smiling man told me to get in. I stepped back instead. He looked at the bag in my hand and told me I should. Before I could decide whether to run or scream or throw the bag in his face and take my chances, another car door opened behind me, and Elias' voice cut through the night like a blade laid flat on glass. He said I was not getting into their car. I turned just enough to see him standing a few feet away with 2 Vance men behind him, including the younger bodyguard from my cart. The smiling man's face hardened. Elias told him to inform Victor Thorne that if he wanted to send messages, he could send them to people who answered to him. The man in the sedan looked at me one last time and said this was what happened now, as if the whole shape of my life had already been redrawn, and I was simply late to noticing. Then the sedan pulled away and I was left on the sidewalk with my pulse racing and anger hitting faster than fear. Elias told me I should not have walked out alone. I told him they should not have let men follow me from Dominic's building. He admitted they had likely been watching the tower already, which was somehow worse. I asked who Victor Thorne was, even though I already suspected the answer. Dominic's rival, Elias said. And when I asked if that meant these men now saw me as a weakness, Elias did not insult me by lying. He said yes. I laughed once because what else was there to do? 1 bowl of pasta and now rival criminals were trying to make me step into cars. Before I could decide whether to blame Dominic, myself, or the whole disease structure of powerful men and the wars they dragged across innocent ground, another door opened behind me. I did not need to turn to know who it was. Dominic stopped beside me, his coat dark against the street light, his face colder than it had been in his own kitchen, and looked down the road where the sedan had vanished. Thorne's men do not speak to what is mine, he said. I turned on him at once. I asked what exactly was his. He looked straight at me and said that I was in danger because he had eaten from my hand, and men like Thorne noticed anything a man like him treated as valuable. I told him value and possession were not the same thing. He said maybe not, but danger did not care about language. That made me angrier because it was too close to true. He stepped nearer then, not crowding me, but close enough that his next words stayed between us. If I wanted to curse him out, he said I could do it in the car, but I was not going to stand on that sidewalk proving a point to men who would use me to break him. I hated that he was right. I hated the calm certainty in his voice. I hated most of all that the city around us had already become less safe simply because I had done what came naturally to me and handed food to a man whose life had forgotten how to accept it. But instincts are one thing and facts are another. And the fact standing in front of me was this. Thorne's men had made contact within minutes. My apartment was no longer a sure place, and the black car waiting at the curb had its rear door open because there were times when getting in did not mean surrender. It meant surviving long enough to decide what to do next. He opened the door himself. I told him this did not make me his. His eyes dropped to my mouth, then came back to my face in one slow, dangerous look. No, he said quietly. But it may make you mine to protect. I should have hated that line completely. Part of me did. The other part, the part that had read his body before he ever spoke to me, recognized something in it that was harder to dismiss. Not ownership, not exactly. Something darker and more careful than that. So, I got in. The car door shut behind me with a soft, heavy sound that somehow felt worse than a slam because a slam would have matched the anger in my chest, while that quiet click felt like something final, something decided without my permission. And for the first few blocks, I did not even look at Dominic because I knew if I looked at him too soon, I was going to say the ugliest thing I could think of just to make sure he felt even half as trapped as I did.